Hey, everybody, and welcome to season 2 of the All About Everest podcast. And I'm your host, Pauline Reynolds Nuttall. On this podcast, you can get anything and everything about Mount Everest, including interviews, book recommendations, tips, updates, and a whole lot more. So, welcome to the spring 2023 Everest climbing season. And here we go. Hey, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the All About Everest podcast. And today I'm just going to recommend some of the best books ever written, in my opinion anyway, about Mount Everest. I've been a huge reader since I was a little kid, and I still purchase paper books. With today's convenience, it's so easy to just go on Amazon or Barnes and Noble and download it to your phone, right? But I still enjoy the feel and the smell of an actual book. In my collection, I have quite a few books about Mount Everest, and I figured that today would be a great time to just go over some of my favorites. Maybe you've heard of them. Maybe you've never heard of any of them. But these are some of my favorites, and I thought I would share those today. Before I get to the actual episode, today was supposed to be an interview, but that didn't happen. It's with someone that I've been trying to connect with for a couple of weeks now. And I don't know why it took me so long to reach out to him, because he literally lives right down the road, like less than 10 miles. And so many people in my area that know about my podcast kept asking me, why wasn't I interviewing him? And I have no idea why. His Everest story is a little bit different than some of the other people that I've interviewed, because he summited Mount Everest in 1992, before it was really commercialized. And he's not one of those younger or youngish climbers that I've had previously. His perspective is absolutely different, and I can't wait to meet up with him on Monday for our interview. I think it will be something different. The next thing I wanted to talk about is there is this video on TikTok that my sister-in-law was telling me about, of someone who's climbing, and I haven't been able to authenticate it. So if anybody can tell me if it's legitimate, let me know. But this viral video, it's showing a woman screaming. She's climbing up some type of mountain, and there's these supposed bodies flying past her. I don't think it's authentic. They're promoting it as this happens on Mount Everest. It really does not look legit to me. So, and I can't find anywhere where to show that it's authentic and not just some prank, or maybe it's people who are body sledding. But it's presented as dead bodies, like literally sliding down Mount Everest, like 3 or 4 of them. And I don't think it's legit. I thought it was like a very bizarre video anyway. So if you guys have any information on it, let me know. So I was asking myself, how do I narrow this down to just 10 books? Because I could talk about books in general for hours and hours, and I'm super passionate about Mount Everest. So I decided I'm going to narrow it down to the top 10 that I think are the most interesting and the best ones. You may or may not agree with me, but if you are looking for 2 lists about books about Mount Everest, you can go to my main website, mamabearoutdoors.com. I have the most or you can Google it too. but I have the most comprehensive list of books about Mount Everest that you can find on the web. And then I just came out with another one with the top 15 books that you should read about Mount Everest. I My main list, I try to update it as much as possible. I know I've missed a few books here and there, and so if I missed one, make sure you let me know so I can add it. It's like with the 1996 Everest disaster, there's like 10 books written just about that. And every year there's another 2 or 3 that come out about Mount Everest in general. And so, again, if I missed any, please let me know so I can add them to that list. And I'll include links in the show notes for both of those lists, just in case you want to check them out. So, the first book on the list for this episode, it came out on December 6th, 2022. Climbing Everest, the complete writings of George Mallory. If there's any book that you read about Mount Everest this year that you haven't read before, read this one. I don't know if people know that George Mallory had a wonderful way with words. He was an author. He didn't publish very much before he lost his life on the mountain, but he had written I believe it was 2 articles for a climbing magazine. And in some of his letters that he wrote to his wife, they're just written in such a beautiful language. He definitely had a way with words, and besides the world losing a great mountaineer, they lost someone that truly could have inspired the world with what they had written, and possibly could have become one of the best classic writers, because really he was very talented when it came to writing. So that's the first book on my list, Climbing Everest, the complete writings of George Mallory, published December 2022, and written by George Mallory. And since I already talked about George Mallory, I should include his climbing partner, Sandy Irvine. And so the second book on my list is Fearless on Everest, The Quest for Sandy Irvine, published on March 2001, written by Julie Summers. Julie is a family member of Sandy. I can't remember off the top of my head if she is his niece or his great niece, but she discovered a bunch of his letters in the attic in 2000 and decided that his story should be told as well. Everybody talks about George Mallory, but not very many people talk about his climbing partner. And so she really gets into who he was as a person, but also why did George Mallory pick someone who not only was much younger than him, but didn't have as much experience as he did in mountaineering. And a part of it is that Sandy was a tinkerer. Like, he could figure out parts, like tinkering in the garage or mechanicking, I guess you would call it. Whatever it was, he was really good with the oxygen systems. And they had decided that they were going to use oxygen to help them summit Mount Everest, which at the time, using O's was an extreme idea. It was something that wasn't really thought of. So, this is the second book on my list, and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was very well written, and Sandy was just as important as George Mallory. We just don't talk about him as much. All right. The third book on my list is Epics on Everest: Stories of Survival from the World's Highest Peak, published on April 21st, 2003, and compiled and edited by Clint Willis. It came out to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first ascent of Mount Everest. And what it is it's a compilation of a whole bunch of different stories and excerpts from other books about Mount Everest, including excerpts from the books by Conrad Anker, Anatoly Bukreev, and several others. It's one of my favorites when I'm looking for something that's short that I don't really want to get into. It could be something, while I'm on my break at work and I only have 15 minutes, so I'll just read one of those chapters. For me, especially since I quit smoking, I always read a book during break, and so something like this is perfect. One of my favorite books. I enjoy the different perspectives, and because I'm familiar with all of these climbers, it's absolutely intriguing. The two seasons that have had the most books written about them were the 1996 Everest disaster and the 2015 avalanche at base camp. So in 1996, at the time, it was considered the deadliest season, the deadliest day, and the deadliest year on Mount Everest. A lot of people are familiar about it. A movie was written. If you're familiar with Rob Hall and Adventure Consultants and Mountain Madness and Scott Fisher, it was one of the worst years on the mountain when it came to fatalities. And then in 2015, it's considered the most deaths, but not the most deaths on the mountain. And so many books already have been written about that season as well. So, how do you pick which books to feature and which ones are the best ones from both of those seasons? And so I decided to pick two from each season. From the 1996 Everest disaster, obviously, I'm going to pick Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. It is probably the most well-known book when it comes to Mount Everest because everybody's read it. John Krakauer is an amazing author, and he's written so many books that have really just inspired people and made them think. And so his book was originally published on October 19th, 1999. And again, it's considered the most read book about Mount Everest and the most comprehensive when it comes to the 1996 Everest disaster. I think most people who have any interest in the mountain have probably read this book because it's kind of the go-to. Uh, for book number 5, again, I chose another book about the 1996 Everest disaster, Left for Dead: My Journey Home from Everest by Beck Weathers, and it was published on September 21st, 2000. Again, so many books have been written about this season, and it was a very controversial season. There are so many different perspectives when it came to all of the deaths, why it happened, how it happened. I chose this one because Beck literally was left for dead. Um his not necessarily his book is well known, it's his face. Because they all thought he was dead. He suffered horrible frostbite on his face, his hands, and so his face has become the most recognizable when it comes to the 1996 Everest disaster. And his story, like how basically he died, and the only thing that kept him going was him thinking about his wife and his kids. And so the fact that he came back from death and he survived, and he was left not once but actually twice. His survival story is absolutely amazing and inspiring, and that's why I chose this book as book number 5. So there are 3, I think maybe even 4 books about the 2015 Everest disaster when the avalanche hit base camp, becoming the deadliest year at Everest, but not the deadliest year on the mountain, which that was 2023 when 17 people died, 12 confirmed and 5 missing, presumed dead. And so I picked, obviously, to me anyway, the books that were written by people that I had interviewed. So the first book is, and this is book number 6 on the list, Everest, It's Not About the Summit by Ellis James Stewart. Ellis is an amazing person. I know he has another book coming out, I believe sometime this year, about Mount Everest. He mentions it in his interview with me, but his first book that came out, it was very inspiring because his Everest story is not everybody else's. He's never reached the summit of Mount Everest. He's tried twice, and each time something has happened. He was there during 2014 when there was the disaster in the Khumbu Icefell, and then again in 2015 when there was the avalanche disaster at base camp. So he's still never made it to the top. He doesn't know if he ever will try another Everest summit attempt, but his whole story is very inspiring, from how he funded his attempts to the community that he has grown online on Facebook, to everyone who loves Mount Everest. Either they're people like me who just find it inspiring and compelling, or people that have climbed it or intend to. Such a great book. And when I think about it, I'm reminded of something that Adrian Bollinger said in his interview with me. Was a success on Mount Everest isn't necessarily reaching the summit. And in Ellis's book, you know that because all of his growth, all of the things that he achieved, his personal aha moments, like he did achieve his summit, just not the one that he thought of. And again, amazing human being, so fun to interview. And book number 7 on my list is The Next Everest by Jim Davidson, who was also there during the 2015 Everest disaster. And he's escaped death before, while climbing. He lost one of his climbing partners on Denali, but then he goes to Mount Everest in 2015. He's going to summit, or at least he thinks so, and he doesn't because of another tragedy in his climbing career. And so his whole book is not only about the tragedy, but it's about, coming back from that tragedy. I interviewed Jim, amazing person as well. And I say that about everybody that I interview, but each person has such a unique story. And Jim's was just as unique as everybody else's has been so far. Totally recommend it. And that's why I picked it for number 7 on my list. Book number 8 on my list is The Dark Summit. Dark Summit, The True Story of Everest's Most Controversial Season, written by Nick Hill, published on August 18th, 2008. And it is about the 2006 climbing season, which, when it comes to death and saving others, it became the most controversial season and maybe still is. I think that 2023, there's going to be a lot of talking about this year's season and what went wrong. But in 2006, David Sharp died on Mount Everest. And what became so controversial was that a lot of people walked past him. And the question was, could people have helped him? There were people who were called out by the media. There were people who lied and said they didn't see him. And so the big question about that season was, would you abandon your summit attempt to save someone? And could you save someone? And why didn't these people save David Sharp? Sorry, I'm getting a little animated here because it's one of those ethical debates when it comes to Mount Everest. And so, 2006 was a really deadly year. I mean, 11 people died that spring season. And so this book really gets into that, and the whys and the hows and the what ifs. So if you haven't read it, you should. And if you don't want to read it or you want more information, you should check out the documentary Dying for Everest, which is about David Sharp and his Everest story, including the testimony of his family and people who were on the mountain the same time he was. It was so hard picking just 10 books for this list and narrowing down the last 2 because there's just so many good ones out there. And like I said, there's, at least 50 books, if not more, that have been written about Mount Everest, you know, in the last 100 years. So I decided that book number 9 would be The Lost Explorer, Finding Mallory on Mount Everest by Conrad Anker and David Roberts. Absolutely one of my favorites, probably in my top 5, but for sure in my top 10 and my top 15. I love this book because I'm kind of obsessed with George Mallory and Cindy Irvine. And you may have noticed that if you've listened to this podcast for a while, or if you follow my blog at all, their story just kind of haunts me. And so when Conrad found George Mallory's body, like, that was just huge. You can find the video clips on YouTube. But Conrad Anker is on my bucket list for podcast interviews, and he lives in Montana, not just down the road, but like 3 hours away, which is almost just down the road when it comes to Montana time, because Montana is the 4th largest state. But this book is absolutely amazing. It really gets into the hunt for George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, why they decided to do it, but also some back history into George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, which, if you don't know, Sandy's first name was actually Andrew. I just forget it a lot of the time. So, number 9 on my list, The Lost Explorer. You should read it if you haven't already. I wanted to add to this book list at least one book either written by a woman or that was about a woman. And when it comes to the mountaineering world, it really is male dominated. And I think there's just a handful of books written by women or about women that have summited Mount Everest. I can think of maybe 5 off the top of my head. And so I chose for book number 10, Honoring High Places, The Mountain Life of Junko Tabe, published December 7th, 2017. It is her autobiography. She did have help writing it. And she was the very first woman who summited Mount Everest. So even though her book isn't just about Mount Everest, it does go into her whole mountaineering journey and how she reached the top of the mountain. And back when she achieved it, like, oh my God. And that's it for today's podcast episode. The 10 best books, I think anyway, that you should read about Mount Everest. Again, really hard to narrow down that list. Most of them are included on my website on a recent post of the top 15 books to read about Mount Everest right now. I will include a link in the show notes so you can go look. I think all of them are included on that list except for Honoring High Places. If there's a book you think should be included on this list, you can let me know. Did you know that on Spotify you can leave comments? So you should do that, or you can also leave them on my website, on social media. You can reach me just about anywhere. Next week's episode, again, it's an interview that I'm really excited to do. I'm recording it on Monday, but I'm not going to say who it is just in case it falls through. But again, he lives right down the road, like less than 10 miles. And it's not Conrad Anker, who lives a little bit more than 10 miles down the road, more like 3 hours. I don't know what that is in miles. Hopefully one of these days I can interview him because, he's on my podcast interview bucket list. So until next time, climb your own climb. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the All About Everest podcast. We would love it if you would rate, subscribe, and follow wherever you listen to your podcast. You can find us on social media at All About Everest Podcast or at Mama Bear Outdoors. You can support our podcast by subscribing to our Patreon or by buying us a coffee. Until next time.